Evolution debunked in 1 minute.
Believe in evolution?
Yeah, I do believe in evolution.
Got a question for you. The eye to work with all parts, it has to be complete. How did man see before the eye evolved?
I'm using the other senses, I assume.
So just feeling and touching. And how did he find his first mate to reproduce? Because she's going to be blind too, because her eyes aren't involved. So both of them are blind, stumbling around. How do they find each other and then have offspring?
I'm not sure I can answer that one.
Do you know what your epiglottis is?
No, I do not.
It's your Adam's apple. It's in your throat. It's an apparatus that stops the food going down the lungs. You'd be dead without it. You'd choke to death. How did man eat food before his epiglottis evolved?
I have no clue. I can't think of anything else.
Speaking of thinking, how did man think before his brain evolved? How did he walk around and look for food and look for a woman and live before his brain evolved? Because it's not going to work if it's not evolved. So how did that happen?
I would assume, like, in time, it takes long periods of time to do, I guess, like, accomplish one thing, I guess, by moving.
How long did he have to wait for his brain to evolve? Are we talking millions of years?
Who knows?
Ask these questions of your evolutionary teacher next time he tells you this and see what he says. He'll have no answer for them. Because evolutionist believers have a certain language. They say maybe, perhaps, probably, could have. There's no facts.
Well, hi there. That was a lot of questions. A whole gish gallop of them. But I have good news. I am a teacher of evolutionary biology and an evolutionary biologist, so let's answer them. That's what he wanted, right? They move pretty fast, so I'll try to get to all of them. Okay, so the first question was, do you believe in evolution? And belief is a word that can mean a lot of things. To be precise, I try to avoid the word believe when I talk about science in general. The truth is that I believe that all science is wrong. Science is a model of reality, not reality itself, and not the truth. The great thing about models is that they can often help us better understand the natural world. Science, at its best, is a highly predictive model of reality. But the problem with models is that they are all wrong. All of them. So I believe that our evolutionary model is wrong. But it is also, based on the evidence that we have available to us at this time, the most predictive and useful model we have ever had to explain how the diversity of life forms that we see today came to be since the dawn of life. I accept it as good science so far as I've been able to evaluate it. So belief is probably the wrong word for it, but I accept it for what it is, a powerfully predictive and useful model. His next question really starts off a list of silly questions. And I think I'll take them on all at once since they all have the same fundamental flaw. In addition to the fact that the epiglottis is not the Adam's apple is a cartilaginous protuberance that protects the larynx, the voice box. The epiglottis is what he described it to be, a leaf-shaped valve that directs food to the esophagus and air to the trachea. So his questions were, how did man see before the eye evolved? How did man mate before the eye evolved? How did man eat food before his epiglottis evolved? How did man think before his brain evolved? How did he walk around, look for food, and live before his brain evolved? And how long did he have to wait for his brain to evolve? And the answer to all of these questions are he didn't and no time at all. The first humans, really no matter how broadly you want to define humans, had eyes, an epiglottis, and a brain. So he didn't have to wait for the brain to evolve, and man didn't see before the eye, eat before the epiglottis, or think before the brain. Because man didn't exist before those structures evolved in his lineage. We don't think that humans evolved from an eyeless, epiglottisless, brainless human. We think that humans evolved from other apes, which evolved from other monkeys, which evolved from other primates, which evolved from other eutherian mammals, which evolved from other mammals, which evolved from other synapsids, which evolved from other amniotes, which evolved from other tetrapods, which evolved from other fish, which evolved from other vertebrates, which evolved from other chordates, and it goes on until you get to the origin of life. And almost all chordates have eyes and a brain. And almost all, if not all, mammals have an epiglottis. And pretty much all other living creatures are doing just fine without one. Plenty of animals are doing just fine today with a brain and no eyes, eyes and no brain, neither a brain nor eyes, and basically all of those animals also don't have an epiglottis. So can animals live without them? Yeah. The overwhelming majority of all animals don't have all three of those features, and many have none of them. They aren't humans, but nobody thinks that we evolved from humans without those features. This is just a straw man argument. Not an uncommon one, but a silly one. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with a straw man argument, we outlined it in our first video on this topic. But a straw man argument is when instead of attacking the best version of a person's argument, the steel man, or even a position the person actually holds, You invent a different, weaker version of their position, the straw man, that they don't even hold, and then tear that down instead. So I'll make this a non-straw man. The questions would then be, how did the ancestors of man see before the eye evolved? How did the ancestors of man find a mate before the eye evolved? How did the ancestors of man eat food before the epiglottis evolved? How did the ancestors of man think before the brain evolved? How did they walk around, look for food, and live before the brain evolved? And how long did they have to wait for brains to evolve? Before the camera-style eye evolved, they probably saw like the animals we described in this video. But before that, they didn't see. They found mates in ways not unlike the way that eyeless animals find mates today, and many were likely asexual. They ate food similarly to the way that almost all animals eat today without epiglottises. In fact, if lungs were not an out pocket of the gut, it would have probably made a lot of sense not to have food and air go down the same tube to start with. But evolution does not work with what would be the best design, but what is available. And lungs coming off of the gut are the only lungs vertebrates have ever had to work with. So they make it work. I'll also add that reptiles seem to do it better. Turtles, for example, don't seem to reuse any tubes. The trachea extends through the tongue, which can seal up to close it off when feeding, and then it plugs into the backside of the nostrils when the mouth is closed and they need to breathe. And snakes have something similar with a glottis that can extend outside of the mouth so they can snorkel around food when eating, then plug it into the nostrils when the mouth is closed. Same problem, different solution. And lots of animals do just fine without brains. Some of them don't even have nervous systems. The oldest evidence of life is about 3.7 billion years old, and the first evidence of organisms with brains is a little over 500 million years old. So it looks like at least 3 billion years. Hope it was worth the wait. Of course, most lineages of organisms are still waiting, and they're doing great. This video is sponsored by our friends at Ground News. As a science-based channel, we care about truth, evidence, and critical thinking, especially in a world so full of noise and sensationalism. It's so easy at this point in time to live entirely in an echo chamber without ever hearing any ideas that maybe place the ones that you already hold into question. Ground News is a website and app created by a former NASA engineer that helps you see how different outlets cover the same story. It pulls articles from over 50,000 sources and shows each one's political bias, factual reliability, and ownership, so you can decide for yourself what to believe. Take this recent story out of Colorado, where rabbits were discovered growing horn-like protrusions. Some outlets leaned hard into the sensational side, calling them Frankenstein, horror, or zombie rabbits. Others stayed grounded in the science, focusing on the confirmed cause, Schopf papillomavirus, a real viral infection that creates those growths and isn't a public threat. That's the beauty of Ground News. It lays the coverage out side by side so you can see exactly how narratives form and where the facts truly lie. The Nobel Peace Center calls Ground News an excellent way to stay informed, avoid echo chambers, and expand your worldview. If you'd like to see the world through every angle, go to ground.news/Clint. You'll get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is the plan we personally use to stay informed and balanced. That's ground.news/Clint. The world is full of fascinating stories. Ground News helps you explore them all with curiosity and clarity. A big thank you to Ground News for supporting our channel and to you for watching. Now back to the video.
I would love to hear you disprove evolution. Can we do that?
Well, the main issue with evolution is the following. The main issue with evolution is we have taken enormous scientific leaps in the fossil records, right? So if evolution is true, then you find single-celled or multi-celled organisms, right? And you go from single-celled or two-celled organisms to four-celled, to 8-celled, to 16-celled. You go through a progressive evolution, if you will, of these organisms evolving into an increasingly more being-like creature. So evolution says basically that some bacteria got together in a mud puddle and they mated, and we went from single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms to quadricellular to hexacellular to multicellular, and then these organisms began to form into systems that created organ systems, and then you basically had what is a rudimentary non-air breathing organism that was in the water to an organism that had gills, and then those gills moved out onto land, and then they started to breathe oxygen, and then this whole lineage of species evolved from this. The problem is there's zero evidence of that. The problem is you have these single-celled organisms and multi-celled organisms, and then there's just a giant gap in the fossil record. And you have animals, and then you have man. But we don't have a fossil record that takes us from single and multi-celled organisms into an entire species. And we just simply ignore that.
Wow.
And so
I didn't know that.
we ignore the science that would validate that evolution was. And two, for me, when I really study the human body, and by the way, we have barely scratched the surface of understanding, this thing that God created. This ecosystem is so intelligent, and it couldn't, not in my opinion, but in the scientific evidence, it could not have been put together by accident. It didn't happen by happenstance.
Oh boy. Okay. This is a hard one. To be perfectly honest, this guy sounds like an improv comic playing an expert arguing against evolution. Or maybe somebody who lied about his qualifications and then wound up being interviewed anyway. But that was a train wreck. And I'm going to do my best to restate his arguments more clearly than that, while addressing some of the erroneous statements that he made as well. It could be that this guy is an actual expert on the human body, but he clearly doesn't know very much about evolution at all. And, I would probably sound pretty crazy if I were asked a bunch of tough questions about human anatomy and physiology and I didn't feel comfortable just saying that I don't know. So I'll try to be charitable. His big picture argument against evolution seems to be perceived holes in the fossil record. He seems to think that we should see a progression from 1 to 2-celled and then 4, 8, and 16-celled organisms, like we see in early cell divisions of multicellular organisms. And then an evolution into progressively more what he calls being-like creatures. And I'm going to pause there because that isn't really what we would expect to find. I would expect the first cellular life forms to be very simple cells, then more complicated cells, and then colonies of cells. It would actually require a lot more mechanisms to get a colony to stop growing at 2, 4, 8, or 16 cells than to just keep growing. And all it takes to get single cells to become a colony is that they have to stick together for some reason. Any reason will do. Bam, you've got a colony. So I would expect to see colonies of cells of no particular size. Then I would expect slight amounts of specialization, perhaps like we see in sponges, where the cells work together but can also survive independently. Then higher levels of specialization where the cells are so interdependent that they can no longer survive in isolation. From there, tissues, organs, organ systems, and I would expect all of that to predate being-like creatures. And I would predict that if by being-like creatures, he means human being-like creatures, and given that human being-like creatures exist now, I would predict that the farther back in time you go, the less human being-like, the most human being-like creatures you can find on Earth will become. And this is the exact pattern that we see not only in the fossil record, but also reflected in the genomes of organisms alive today. You can use nothing but the genetic code of living organisms to build a phylogenetic tree of life, and the pattern that I just described, that is also reflected in the fossil record, very much emerges from it. But he wasn't done, because he then took another crack at explaining how evolution should have happened, and this one is differently bad. He claims that evolution says that some bacteria got together in a mud puddle, and they mated, and we went from single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms to quadricellular to hexacellular, then back to multicellular. And then these organisms began to form into systems that created organ systems. And then you had a rudimentary non-air breathing organism that was in the water to an organism that had gills. And those gills moved out onto land and they started to breathe oxygen. And then this whole lineage of species evolved from this. I'll start off by correcting a few details. First, We don't think that bacteria are the ancestors of other life forms, in particular anything with organ systems, gills, or anything like that. Bacteria seem to form their own monophyletic group. Archaea would be the group of non-eukaryotic life forms from which other life appears to have come. Second, bacteria don't mate. They reproduce asexually, mostly by binary fission, sometimes swapping bits of genetic material with one another via horizontal gene transfer, but that isn't reproduction, let alone sexual reproduction. And I don't know what a mud puddle has to do with any of this. Third, I don't know how we're going from single-celled to multi-celled and then to quadricellular, then hexacellular this time, not octacellular like before, and then back to multicellular again. I'm assuming that the first multi-celled meant two-celled, but multicellular was actually a better word. Life likely went from single-celled to multi-celled, and then not all these other weird steps he outlined. Okay, then to rudimentary systems, then organ systems, then rudimentary non-air-breathing organisms in the water. I'm fine with all of that. Then an organism that had gills, also good. Then those gills moved onto land, okay. Then they started to breathe oxygen. I think he meant air. They were extracting oxygen from the water with those gills, and with other structures even before those gills came to be. Everything that does aerobic cellular respiration is breathing oxygen, even bacteria. And truth be told, looking just at organisms alive today, the ability to extract oxygen from air probably predated a move onto land. Literally all bony fishes, every lineage, have lungs. In one lineage of ray fin fishes, those lungs have been modified into a swim bladder, and in coelacanths, those lungs are filled with oil to help with buoyancy, more like the fatty livers of cartilaginous fishes than the swim bladders of some ray fin fishes. But many fishes, even fishes that don't leave the water, have lungs and can extract oxygen from air. Some of them leave the water. And others can extract oxygen from air using other structures, like the labyrinth organ of bettas, since their lungs are busy regulating their buoyancy. I guess what I'm saying is that the organisms with those gills that moved onto land could probably extract oxygen from air long before those gills moved onto land, at least if we're talking about vertebrates. And of course, we see lots of animals with gills moving around on land today. So I don't know what is so odd about saying that this can happen. And while soft tissues like lungs fossilize poorly, the fossils and genetic evidence available to us suggest that this is what happened. One cell to multicellular, to systems, organ systems, and organisms in the water, then gills, then extract oxygen from air, then move on to land. And of course, once vertebrates moved on to land, well, there were a lot of open niches. So a lot of radiation from those original land colonizers is not unexpected. And again, is quite well reflected in the fossil and genetic records. So when he says that there is zero evidence of that, I have no idea what he's talking about. We have basically no evidence that it happened any other way. And that is where we get to his third retelling of evolutionary history. We have single-celled organisms, then multi-celled organisms, then a giant gap in the fossil record, and you have animals. And then you have man. What? I'll start with the fact that the basal most animals alive today are not all that different from a colony of other eukaryotic cells. I'm teaching animal diversity online right now at Clint's Life Science Academy, and if you're in that class, you know that animals like sponges and placozoans are pretty basic. The earliest animals in the fossil and genetic record are really simple compared to something like the man that he claims just popped up in the fossil record. We find very simple animals like primitive sponges and placozoans, then slightly more complex animals like cnidarians, then simple bilaterally symmetrical animals, eventually simple chordates, simple vertebrates, simple fish-like organisms, early bony fishes, early tetrapods, early amniotes, early synapsids, early mammals, early eutherian mammals, and a progression of more and more primate-like mammals until you get clear primates. A progression of primates until you get early monkeys. A progression of monkeys until you get apes. A progression of apes until you get apes more like humans than our chimpanzees. And a progression of more human-like apes until you get some that were unmistakably human. We're going through that progression right now in this video. There isn't a huge gap. I would accept the possibility that he doesn't know about the fossils that we have, but to say that they don't exist is just inaccurate, if not a lie. And again, I wouldn't be shocked at all if I found out that this guy is in a Freaky Friday situation where he switched bodies with his dad, who is a human biologist, and had to fake his way through this interview. I just want to add that every week we make an entire extra video for our Stinkin' Rad fans on Patreon. It's called Patreon Extras, and the ones for these videos might be the best Patreon Extras videos of all. If you guys are on Patreon and have seen these Patreon Extras videos before, please chime in and say if you agree or disagree with that statement. But they're some of the most viewed, and I think they're really, really good. They bring a lot of discussion because we always have a lot to talk about when we're talking about all of this. And so if you want to see those extra videos or the other cool features we have for our patrons, or just support this channel and doing more things like this and the other kinds of videos that we make, please consider checking it out.
They say fossils prove evolution. I say, guys, you got to be kidding. Fossils prove evolution? No fossil counts for evidence for evolution. None. Fossil record? There is no fossil record. There are a bunch of bones in the dirt. Now you're putting your interpretation on them, okay? It's not a record. This guy says evolution is a fact and the best evidence for evolution is the fossils. That's silly, okay? There is no fossil record. You cannot look back in the fossil record. You look at fossils in the present. You put your interpretation on them, okay? There is no fossil record. It's stupid to say that that's evidence. If you find a bone in the dirt, all you know is it died. You can't prove it had any kids that lived. You sure can't prove it had different kids. And why would you think a bone you found in the dirt can do something animals today cannot do, which is produce something other than their kind? No, the fossil record, that would not hold up 2 seconds as evidence in a court of law. There are no missing links. The whole chain is missing. Stephen Gould said, the absence of fossil evidence is a nagging problem for evolution. We got a good theory, if only we had some evidence. Now that's just stupid, Stephen, okay? By the way, Stephen Gould died with a set of my tapes on his library shelf. I went to visit him a few years before he died. He wasn't there to talk to his secretary. I donated my videotapes to Stephen Gould years ago. Had him sitting on right there next to his desk. Hope he watched them. Hope he got saved. Maybe he did. I don't know. Hope so. But to believe that we've got a good theory, we just don't have any evidence. Okay, well then maybe consider the theory might not be right, okay?
Okay, so that's a different approach. Instead of saying that there are giant holes in the fossil record, why not just claim that there is no fossil record? But I've got to tell you, we're going to dive deep into some really cool aspects of ecology, paleontology, and evolution to address this argument. So maybe go get your popcorn. Okay, so his argument is that there is no fossil record at all. No fossil accounts for evidence of evolution. What we have are a bunch of bones in the dirt. You cannot look back in the fossil record. You look at fossils in the present, and you put your interpretation on them. If you find a bone in the dirt, all you know is that it died, and I would assume lived for some period of time, though he didn't say that. You wouldn't know that it had any offspring that survived, especially that were different from their parents. And he asks why you would think that a bone in the dirt would be able to do something that animals today cannot do, namely produce something other than their kind. He then asserts that there are no missing links. Rather, the entire chain is missing. And then he quotes something from Stephen Jay Gould that we will address after we get through this first part. But I think we need to talk about this first claim first, that there is no fossil record. That's absurd. There are fossils, and even if they are just a record that something died, well, that's a record of something. But that isn't all that they record. They tell us a lot also about the size and basic anatomy of that organism. They tell us what other organisms lived in their environment. They often tell us what that animal ate, and sometimes what ate them. They often teach us about behaviors those organisms likely exhibited. They can teach us about their reproductive strategies and growth patterns. They tell us where they lived, and thanks to technologies like the radiometric dating that we discussed in this video, they often tell us approximately when that organism lived. So there is clearly a fossil record. The assertion that there isn't is absurd on its face. But the question remains, is the fossil record that we have evidence for evolution, or is it not? Because it is true that if you find a bone in the dirt, you don't know if it had any offspring that survived. You wouldn't know if any offspring that it did have were different from the organisms that you found. And you sure wouldn't have any reason to suspect that the offspring did what no extant animal can do today, evolve out of a clade, or as he says, produce something other than their kind. We'll talk more about that distinction in a moment. But let's talk about whale evolution for a minute. Whale evolution is a fun subject, not because the fossil record is much more complete than it is for other organisms, though it may be simply because very large bones often preserve better than small ones, but because the change is so dramatic. You're probably familiar with whales. And the funny thing about whales isn't really their size or basic shape, it is that they're mammals. And mammals are not typically a marine group. In fact, if evolution is true, then whales would necessarily have come from terrestrial ancestors. That, or they aren't really mammals and simply converged on much of the mammalian anatomy and genetics. For example, they are endothermic, with hair, fingers in their flippers, a chorioallantoic placenta, a spine that bends up and down instead of side to side, 7 neck vertebrae, synapsid skulls, and mammary glands, just to get us started. They also have a multi-chambered stomach and other features in common with ungulate mammals specifically. And their genetic makeup is more similar to ungulates. Many ungulates, in fact, are more genetically similar to whales than they are to most other ungulates, and way more similar to whales than they are to any non-ungulate mammals or any other forms of non-ungulate life. And we could hypothesize, I suppose, that ungulates all came out of the sea, with only whales maintaining their ancestral form. But then we would have the fact that ungulates are more genetically similar to carnivorans than carnivorans are to anything else. Pretty soon we would find that all mammals would have needed to have come out of the sea, with only whales and sirenians remaining there full time. And it wouldn't just end with the mammals. So this from the sea hypothesis just keeps getting pushed back, with more and more distinct lineages colonizing the land without leaving any, or at least many, ocean-bound relatives. It is pretty clear, just from the genetics, but also based on fossils, that ungulates have an origin on land. So if evolution is true, then whales, or the ancestors of whales, need to have lived on land at some point. And they probably needed to be fairly similar to ungulates that we know today. So I would predict that somewhere on Earth there should exist fossils of animals that are clearly ungulates, older than the oldest fossils of whales, that have features that we only find today in whales. And that is how science works. Science is never absolutely certain that it has found the truth. It's a model, after all. It almost certainly has not found the exact truth. But the scientific method works by creating models that make predictions, and then testing those predictions to see if they are accurate or inaccurate based on the evidence that we can observe in the here and now. In this case, already, we know that the genetic evidence supports the idea that whales are the descendants of land mammals. But what about the fossil evidence? Well, we have a prediction. A fossil of a land ungulate, older than the oldest whale fossils, with features we find today only in whales, should exist. If whales did not evolve from land ungulates, then there is no reason to suspect that such a fossil should exist. But if they did evolve from land ungulates, then we should, at some point, be able to find such a thing. So did we? Yes. In 1981, in Pakistan, we found the first fossil of this animal, Pachycetus. Not the only skeleton of Pachycetus that we would find, but the first. A 4-legged, largely carnivorous animal with nostrils at the front of its snout, heterodont dentition, meaning that it had multiple kinds of teeth, that was about the size of a wolf. We know that it was an ungulate, specifically an artiodactyl, because it had a double pulley astragalus, a feature unique to the Artiodactyla, the group of ungulates in which, based on the genetic evidence, whales belong. So it had a feature that is completely unique to the group of ungulates that we would expect whales to have come from. But did it have any clear whale features? Yes. Specifically in its inner ear, where it had a very whale-like ear with a large auditory bulla formed exclusively from the ectotympanic bone, a feature that we see today in only one group, whales. Did this prove that these fossils of Pachycetus had any offspring? That their offspring were different from their parents? Or that whales are the descendants of Pachycetus? No, science doesn't work in proof. You're thinking of math. But it does support our hypothesis in that our prediction that if whales evolved from land ungulates, we should be able to find fossils of land ungulates with features unique to whales today was accurate. But that isn't the only fossil that we would predict to exist. Because if Pachycetus is actually the ancestor of whales, then I would next predict that there should be fossils of whale-like animals with features more like Pachycetus than like modern whales, but more like whales than Pachycetus. And those fossils should date to be younger than the fossils of Pachycetus. They should have features like increasingly homodont, or all the same, teeth. Their nostrils should move from the front of the skull to the top of the skull. Their legs should become more flipper-like, with decreasing mobility in their wrists and 4 or 5 fingers like we see today in whales. And their back legs and entire pelvic girdle should shrink eventually to the tiny size that it is in modern whales. And yet they should maintain the inner ear morphology of Pakicetus and whales, and the up and down spinal flexion found in land mammals and whales, and the other basic features of mammals still observed in whales today. If whales evolved from creatures like Pakicetus, then these fossils should exist. If not, then there's no reason that such creatures should be predicted to have ever existed. And if I was going to pick a place to look for them, I would look in rock layers that date to be younger than those where we find Pakicetus, and I would start my search in Pakistan. Well, in 1992, we found a near complete skeleton of this creature, Ambulocetus. And guess where? Pakistan. Pakicetus fossils date to be about 50 million years old. Ambulocetus was found in layers dating to 47 to 48 million years old. So right when and where you would expect to find them. Ambulocetus, like Pakicetus, had 4 legs with 5 toes, though the 5th toe is much smaller than the other toes, unlike in Pakicetus, but much like what we see in whales. With heterodont dentition, but with less differentiation between tooth types than Pakicetus. It had hind limbs, but not as large and robust relative to the animal as Pakicetus, with a double polea astragalus. It was a larger animal than Pakicetus, about 10 feet long. To my knowledge, we don't have the front of the skull, but unless it didn't have nostrils, they were still probably located near the front, since they're not on the rest of the skull that we do have. And it not only maintained the ear morphology shared between Pakicetus and whales, but also has additional ear adaptations related to hearing underwater versus those of Pakicetus. Adaptations that we see today in whales. Does this prove that whales evolved from Pakicetus or other land ungulates? No. But it's yet another animal that we would predict to have existed only if whales are the descendants of land ungulates. But this isn't where it ended, because in rock layers dating to about 47 million years ago in, you guessed it, Pakistan, in 1992, we found the first of several of these, Rhodocetus, about the same length as Ambulocetus. It had a double polea astragalus, its heterodont teeth were even more similar to one another, and its nostrils were positioned over the canine teeth instead of at the end of the snout. Proof? No, but predicted, but only if whales evolved from land ungulates. This animal is Basilosaurus. Saurus because it was mistaken for a reptile when it was first described in the 1830s, until its double-rooted teeth gave it away as a mammal, though a feature that we don't see in modern whales, but we do see in all of the whale-like creatures that we have discussed so far. And of course, land ungulates. They are found in rock layers that date between about 41 and 34 million years old. This is a huge animal, with some of them getting over 16 meters, about 52 feet long, sometimes larger. And yet individuals of that size had hind legs just over 1/3 of a meter, 14 inches long with only 3 toes, with a double polea astragalus. Proportionally highly reduced versus anything we've discussed so far, but much larger than those of whales alive today. With ears even more like those of modern whales, with many of the same adaptations to hearing underwater that we see in modern whales. A nose located even higher on the skull, and front limbs very similar to modern toothed whales in structure, with 5 fingers, low wrist flexibility, and a short humerus radius and ulna, like a flipper. It clearly had tail flukes. Its neck vertebrae were shortened, a trend observed in some of the earlier whale-like animals that we've discussed, but not yet fully fused as they are in modern whales. They had an asymmetrical skull, like that of modern toothed whales, but without the melon that toothed whales use for echolocation. Proof? No, but again, predicted, but only if whales evolved from land ungulates. And these are not all of the fossils of increasingly whale-like artiodactyls that we have found in rock layers that date older than the oldest modern whale fossil anywhere on Earth. Not absolute proof, but absolutely what we would predict if whales evolved from land ungulates, and not at all something we would predict to find otherwise. Again, there are more. And this isn't all that connects these species to whales, but it's a start. Maybe we'll make a full video on this subject sometime soon, if you're into that kind of thing. But it isn't surprising that we don't have absolutely every step in the evolution of every species. The conditions for fossilization are fairly rare, as are the conditions to find fossils. So only a tiny fraction of all things that have ever lived became fossils, and only a tiny fraction of those fossils have ever been found. But the reality is that based on what we can observe in the here and now, the evidence is exactly what you would expect to find if whales evolved from land organisms, specifically artiodactyl ungulates. And not at all what you would expect to find if not. Both the genetic and fossil evidence that are all visible now tell the exact same story. That is what we mean by the fossil record. That is how you use it to test hypotheses. You look at fossils in the present, that's true. But it is disingenuous to say that you can't use them to test hypotheses about the past. You absolutely can. You don't know that the fossils had kids that lived, or kids different from themselves, but you can tell that what came after them was exactly what you would expect to find if they did. Now, when it comes to producing something other than their kind, this is a place where, for one reason or another, creationists often greatly misrepresent evolutionary theory. Creationists often talk about something called a created kind, or a baramin, a group of organisms that are related to one another by shared ancestry, but not to other kinds, because each kind was created independently by God. So the kinds share common ancestry within their kind, but not with members of other kinds. And they usually say that kinds are roughly equivalent to a Linnaean family. Their concept of kinds generally coincide with relatively small clades of organisms. Often clades that are related to one another closely enough that there is some compatibility between the gametes of all of the members of the clade. But that isn't absolutely essential. Gamete compatibility confirms that they are part of the same kind, but it is not requisite for them to be members of the same kind. This definition is neither in the dictionary or in the Bible, but it is pretty widely held by Young Earth Creationists. What they often request is for examples of one kind giving birth to another kind, often like a dog giving birth to a cat or vice versa. And the truth is that we don't think that happens. In fact, if that was ever observed, it would totally challenge everything we think we know about evolution. What we do think happens is that new clades can form within existing clades. The definition of a clade is a common ancestor and all of its descendants. It is definitionally impossible to evolve out of a clade, which is why not all dogs have bones and why humans are monkeys. You can't escape a clade. That doesn't mean that new clades can't form, but again, it would be within an existing clade. So even if the eventual descendants of small land-dwelling artiodactyl ungulates end up as giant flippered beasts that live in the sea, have only tiny hind leg vestiges, and have noses up on top of their heads, they are still artiodactyls and ungulates and eutherians and mammals and synapsids and amniotes and tetrapods and bony fishes and vertebrates and chordates and deuterostomes and bilaterians and animals and eukaryotes and archaeans and cellular life forms. You can't get out of those clades. They are a new kind of artiodactyl and ungulate and eutherian and mammal and synapsid and amniote and tetrapod and bony fish and vertebrate and chordate and deuterostome and bilaterian and animal and eukaryote and archaean and cellular life form, but they are still all of those things. So nothing can evolve out of its kind. The question is, how many kinds are there? And at least in the case of whales, the evidence, fossil and molecular, is pretty overwhelming that they are a kind of artiodactyl. I'm fine with that. It has nothing to do with whether or not there is a god. And their descendants will always be whales, even if they grow tentacles, shoot fire, and live on the moon. Organisms change. We agree about that. And they don't evolve out of the clades of their ancestors. We agree about that too. There will always be missing links because we will never find fossils of every population of animals that has ever lived. But we keep finding more and more links. And most of the time, the evolutionary model would predict that they should have existed at that time in the fossil record, and often right where they were found, which is pretty darn astounding if the model turns out to be as highly flawed as creationists claim. We've got a good theory, and every day more evidence. As far as the quote from Stephen Jay Gould, his full quote was, "The absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates in many cases, has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution." Now, this was said some time ago when the fossil record was less complete than it is now, but more importantly, this wasn't him debating the overall pattern that we see in the fossil record of predictable changes happening over time. The question is, why do we seem to see it happening almost in jumps rather than a continuous slow pace? He wasn't advocating that evolution doesn't occur. That would fly in the face of all that we know from genetics, fossils, and comparative anatomy, among other disciplines. The question is, does it happen continuously, or does it happen in jumps followed by periods of relative stasis? An idea for which he was a strong proponent, and that I find highly plausible, called punctuated equilibrium, where at times major changes in the environment or significant new variation drives a period of rapid evolution, like I'm sure occurred when tetrapods first left the water. Whatever made that transition viable for the first time suddenly opened the door to a host of new variants being successful in ways that they were not in the water. In a very short time, huge amounts of evolution would almost certainly need to occur in that lineage as they become better adapted to the new world in which they reside, and as they fill the hosts of open niches. But once they've filled all of the niches that were easily filled by early tetrapods, and once they were relatively well adapted to the terrestrial life, well, there'd be a lot less to drive rapid evolution. A period of very slow evolution is likely to occur until either the environment changes or some major new feature, say like skin that is impermeable to water, opens up a new door, again driving rapid evolution of that portion of the population that can go through. This is what he was advocating. And quoting him out of context to make it seem like he was saying something that he wasn't, in fact even saying words that he never said or implied, is disingenuous at best. And that isn't out of the ordinary for Kent Hovind, who is the speaker in this video. And the thing is that even many creationists disavow him. But I keep covering his talking points because creationists post his clips all of the time, probably more than anyone else. So he might not be the best advocate for their cause, but he is probably the most watched and shared by YECs. And I'll tell you, he played a large role in turning me into an atheist in my youth. In fact, I doubt there are many people who have done so much to make atheists as he has. I would reckon that he has made far, far, far more atheists from theists than theists from atheists. And even though now I am not an atheist at all, in fact, I am what I would have considered in the past almost psychotically religious, he has whacked me twice in his whack and atheist segments, just because he wants to turn me into an atheist again so badly. But even though, as someone who believes in God, I think that what he does is immoral and terrible, I just want to point out that I wish him no ill will. I don't need him to be silenced. Right after he whacked me, Clint of Clint's Reptiles, he was bitten by a rattlesnake. I'm glad he was okay. I think his words cause harm to people. And how do you combat his terrible arguments? By correcting them. By making better arguments. By demonstrating with patience and without strawmanning why his arguments, in their strongest and most accurate form, are flawed. And if I can't do that, then I really need to wonder if I'm even on the right side. We live in a time of such extreme tribalism. As such, we are prone to fight for positions that are just wrong, incorrect. Just because our side believes it, that doesn't make it right. And sometimes when we find that we can't defeat words with words, we get angry, and sometimes violent. But the reality is that if you can't defeat speech with speech, you either need to learn more or you need to accept the fact that you might be wrong. And in the end, would you rather be on the side of your tribe or on the side of truth? You know where I'll be.
Why are youth leaving the church in such large numbers?
Well, I believe then it's the surveys that we've done that show the number one reason is science. And when they say science, they basically mean evolution. They're taught an evolutionary history of the world, which contradicts the Bible's history. And it's such a shame, as I said, because we have so much information. But here's the point. If we know that in advance, if we know that the students are raising that as their number one objection, shouldn't we be doing something to counter that? You know, it's not maybe or perhaps our children are going to be taught evolution in the school system and in universities tomorrow. They will be taught that. So therefore, evolution and creation, like other issues, if we know that's what they're going to be taught, we should be addressing it before they encounter this. And the reality is we have so much evidence. You know, today we have more evidence to support biblical creation than at any time in the church's history.
I want to start off by saying that for years, I taught biology at Brigham Young University, a university operated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and largely attended by members thereof. The church with, according to a Pew Research survey conducted a few years prior, the second lowest acceptance rate for evolution of all major religious groups, only behind Jehovah's Witnesses. Lower than evangelical Protestants. Though some of that, I think, was due to the way that the question was asked. In my class, I taught less about religion than I have in this video. This was a biology class. I gave one quote from a religious leader, and that was it. And as an evolutionary biologist, and given that evolution is the thing that ties together the entire field of biology, I taught evolution as unabashedly to these Latter-day Saints as I have to you guys on this channel. On day one, we discussed natural selection, Darwin's theory. And by the end of the course, they all understood that we not only come from monkeys, but worse, we are monkeys. You can't evolve out of a clade, And being a religious institution, part of the course evaluation that my students completed at the end of the semester was about how my class had impacted their faith, or as they put it, strengthened their testimony. And every single semester, in every section I taught, my students reported that my class largely about evolution, unabashedly about evolution, strengthened their testimony. And not just more than the biology department average, but more than the university average. In other words, at a religious university where every student needs to complete a significant number of courses in religion specifically, and where a large percentage of all classes begin with a prayer, my class about evolution strengthened their faith more than is typical of that university's classes. Not one prayer. And we only mentioned the Creator when we referenced his inordinate fondness for beetles. So maybe it isn't the evolution that is driving people from your churches. Maybe it's the fact that you are teaching them that they can either accept God or science, but not both. And when you back up your case for God by misrepresenting science and the Bible, sooner or later, they find out. And when they do, they will only believe one thing that you told them. They will accept science and reject God. I know that's what happened to me. You can try to defend God with lies and manipulation, but you don't have to. As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon.
The problem is you have these single-celled organisms and multi-celled organisms, and then there's just a giant gap in the fossil record.
I wouldn't be shocked at all if I found out that this guy is in a Freaky Friday situation where he switched bodies with his dad, who is a human biologist, and had to fake his way through this interview.
You're slam dunking this guy.
It's real bad.
Who is this guy?
I have no idea.
Let's see if we can figure it out.
It is wild. I haven't had one of these that is as hard to listen to as this one. It's some wild stuff.